Hello, everybody here at the venue. Welcome on the stream. Thanks for joining my talk. It's absolutely fantastic to be part of Ubuntu Summit 2023. Yeah. About 23 years ago, when I started as a software engineer, there was a legend out there, a software engineer to whom we all looked up. Nowadays, he's best known for creating Trello and Stack Overflow. So maybe you can guess already that it's Joel Spolsky. Back then, he was best known for his blog, and his most famous blog post was Things You Should Never Do, Part 1. Actually, I never figured out whether it's a Part 2, so maybe you know. And in this blog post, he named the single worst strategic mistake a software company, organization, team, or developer can do. And that is to rewrite software from scratch. But actually, that is what we did. For the TOX test automation tool, a tool downloaded more than 12 million times a month, both heavily used in the open source community and by multi-billion-dollar companies alike. And today I wanted to tell you the story of TOX and especially about the rewrite. You will learn about the reasons of the rewrite, the plannings, the ups and downs, and how we finally released it. And most important, you will learn more about us, the maintainers. But first about me. My name is Jürgen Gmauch. I'm a senior software engineer at Canonical, the company best known for creating Ubuntu. I work in the fantastic Launchpad team. We take care of the build infrastructure of Ubuntu. So anytime you do an apt install, this goes for our little machines. Please reach out to me via Twitter or Mastodon. I also have a blog, but it's not as famous as Joel's. I'm one of the maintainers of TOX, that's why I'm here. I'm a fellow of the Python Software Foundation, and I live at the outer reach of the Bavarian forest. And that's possible because of the new remote world, right? But actually, it's not new for Canonical. We are remote first and only for 19 years. And we're hiring, both Canonical in general and especially my team. We are looking for a couple of Python engineers on all levels, and also for a staff engineer and for a manager. So if you want to work with me, please reach out to me or visit my website. Let's talk about TOX. TOX is a test automation tool. But what does that even mean? In order to explain, we need to have a look how testing is usually done. So let's assume you're a maintainer of an app or library and you test it the manual way. So this means you need to create a virtual environment, you build the package, you install the package, you install the test dependencies like PyTest or coverage. You run the tests, and then probably you also want to run your linters and build documentation and other things. And that is only on your PC for one Python version, for one framework version. So you need to duplicate it many, many times. And think about setup in CI and about your colleagues and about external contributors. They only need to repeat it, and that's pretty tedious. So there is a better way. You can use TOX. You just create a configuration file, specify the Python versions you want to test against in the env list, like here Python 3.8 through Python 3.12. Then you set up the test environment. That means you define the test dependencies and the test command. And as this configuration file is checked in on the version control like Git, it is available to you, to your colleagues, to external contributors, and in CI. All you need to do is to run TOX. I usually install TOX via pipx. Pipx is an awesome tool to install and run Python command line tools. In order to understand the rewrite, we need to understand the roots of TOX. TOX was written by Holger Krickel in 2010 already. You may not be familiar with that name. Holger not only created TOX, but PyTest, DevPy, and PyPy. Not the package index, but the alternative Python implementation. Then some time passed, 7 years. TOX got pretty popular. Some even called it the standard in testing. And then Bernard Gabor joined the TOX team, not because he wanted to become an open source maintainer, but out of necessity. He wanted some bugs fixed and some feature requests implemented. But soon he noticed TOX was written with specific assumptions. It is used to create a Python environment, not a Conda environment or a Docker environment. You can only use it on your local system. It has to be configured via TOX INI, not via the modern project YAML file or maybe a Python file. It is used to build source distributions and not really for wheels. And Talks used to evaluate the configuration eagerly at startup. We have seen this very small example, but they can grow really big. And then it takes a lot of time for the startup, but it's not necessary. And he noticed that changes are hard or even impossible. So what do you do when you just join a project and you're not perfectly happy with it? Obviously, you want to rewrite it. But as you can see, Bernard started the first rewrite attempt, but it was not successful. He did not finish it. But Bernard gained some valuable insights from that. And shortly after that, Holger left the project. And you need to know this is something absolutely healthy. You don't need to stick around with a project you created or you maintained forever. So when I tell people that I'm a maintainer of Tox, I often get asked, why did you create Tox and why did you call it Tox? And then I have to answer, I did not create it. I just joined much, much later. And I think it's a very normal process. Soon afterwards, Bernard noticed a pattern in the bug reports for Tox. Actually, those bug reports were mostly not directed for Tox, but for virtualenv. And virtualenv is used in the background of Tox to create virtual environments. At that time, virtualenv was not really well maintained. Bernard fixed a couple of bugs and eventually became a maintainer of virtualenv. And what do you do when you become a maintainer of a project and you're not entirely happy? You rewrite it, right? And Bernard started rewriting virtualenv. And before I tell you whether this was successful or not, I want to put this into perspective. Back then, I was a SOAP maintainer. SOAP is one of Python's oldest web frameworks, and it has more like 300 repositories and plugins and packages. And back then, we started migrating them from Python 2 to Python 3. And honestly, I was completely lost. I created lots of virtual environments, moved code back and forth, and then I asked the other maintainers, how do you do this? And they said, hey, we just use Tox. And that's how I learned about Tox. And you need to know, back then I was already 10 years in the industry and working as a professional Python developer, and I did not know about this valuable tool. So I think that's why it is so important that you go to conferences like here and exchange knowledge with others and maybe contribute to open source to broaden your knowledge. So the resolution to the question whether Bernard finished the rewrite, yes, and it was a big success. And actually, this is even more scary than the rewrite of Tox because virtualenv has like 90 million downloads a month. And he also created a fantastic talk about some learned lessons and about the technical aspects of rewriting. You should watch it. Only a week after, Bernard announced Tox second edition rewrite on Twitter. And a little bit later, he created a first commit. And then something very special happened. Bernard started streaming the rewrite on Twitch. I learned about that on Twitter and I joined the Twitch streams. And there were not a lot of visitors, right? But I really, really enjoyed those streams. You need to imagine back then, I was the single Python developer at my old company with not a lot of contact to the outside world. And then there was this super experienced developer live streaming the recreation of a tool I loved and sharing his thoughts about architecture and design decisions. I was completely sucked into this Tox thing. After that, I started answering Tox questions on Stack Overflow. And you may wonder why, hey, how can you do this? Why do you do this? You just started using this tool. But that's the way I like to learn the ins and outs of something by helping others. I also gave a talk about Tox at the Python Ireland meetup. At that time, I was super confused how to run my linters. Should I run it via CLI, using my VS Code plugin, via Tox, via pre-commit, or even makefiles? And what about on CI? Do I have to duplicate everything? It took me a while, but I think I came up with a great solution, which I then showed as a lightning talk. I also started contributing to discussions and GitHub issues for Tox. I answered new questions and issues, and I went through the backlog and checked whether old issues are still valid. And then Bernard announced Tox 4 Alpha 2 on Twitter. And he also asked the users to try to test the version because it was the first one you could actually use in production. So I tested my personal projects, my 10 or so work projects, And then I remember, hey, I'm also helping to maintain the 300 SOAP repositories, and they all use TOX. I thought, how could I test the TOX alpha against the 300 repositories? And I did not want to do this manually, right? So I used another tool. It's called All Repos, a tool to clone and manipulate Git repositories at scale. But it offered no way to run arbitrary command line tools with it. So I wrote a plugin to run TOX against all these 300 repositories. And I didn't say it was successful. So only 22% of the test runs succeeded. And then I reached out to Bernard, and I think he had the perfect answer. A 22% success here. That's not that great news, but on the plus side, it seems if you fix SOAP, we should be in a decent place. And I think that's the way. You need to be optimistic. At that time, we also got some feedback on Twitter, especially as Bernard announced that the plugin system won't be backwards compatible. And Oliver, back then, also TOX maintainer, asked, are the people with the torches and the pitchforks at the gate already? And spoiler, they were not yet, but we will come back to that later. We also got some positive feedback from Chark, who is usually at every conference around the globe. I'm not sure why she's not here. She reported a possible bug, which I could resolve, and then she said something nice. And I think feedback is something very important, as usually we only get bug reports, or there are people who want their 500 lines configuration file debugged. So if you use open source software, please reach out to the maintainers and say thank you. And then I created my first serious pull request for TOX. I fixed bugs, which I reported earlier, and so I could give something back. And it was pretty busy doing those. Lots of pull requests, one after another. And this went on for some time, and then Bernard announced me as a TOX maintainer. And that was, you need to know, this was an amazing experience, becoming the maintainer of such a critical and vital tool. Only later I realized that this is a lot of work for free. I also created another talk about the mass testing the TOX4 against the 300 SOAP repositories at the World Clone Day. And you might see a pattern here. We tried to spread the word about TOX4 and the rewrite, to inform the people about it. As we were aware, when you rewrite the project, some bad things can happen. And we wanted all the users out there to test TOX4 before the release, ideally. Bernard announced TOX4 at the PyCon US via Lightning Talk. And then imagine, now it's the end of 2021. We're already 1.5 years into rewrite, and people got very impatient already. And then life happened. Bernard moved to the US, and you don't do this on a weekend. I started to build a house and had no spare time. And I also joined Canonical, and I certainly wanted to put quite some effort into it to make a good job, a great job. And again, we are 1.5 years into the rewrite. And then we basically paused the rewrite for a full year. We were only 2 active maintainers and we had no spare time. You can imagine that the people got angry. And here we go with the torches and the pitchforks. We got some feedback like this, that multi-year rewrite seems to never reach general availability. If it was a business, it would have been bankrupt one long time ago. And at first I thought, oh my God, such a... but then I thought, what if they're right? What if we are really doing something wrong? And once again, Bernard stepped in and I think I gave a great answer. Such a major release will ultimately break a lot of people, and we need maintainer availability to help the users and address their concerns. I think that's a really great answer. So it was about our users and not about us, the maintainers. And then something remarkable happened, which I never experienced in my career before. We received a bug report about a vulnerability, a security vulnerability of PyLib, which is a dependency of TOX. And you need to know, we only use this library for TOX3, but not for TOX4. And it was only the subversion module the SVN module was affected, which we didn't even use. So TOX is not really affected, right? But there are tools out there like pip audit and safety, which check your supply chain, which is a really good thing. But that also means that for a lot of people, CI was broken. And there was no easy way out. We had no time to move TOX 4 over the finish line. So we recommended to whitelist this vulnerability. I will ask my colleague about whether this is a good idea or not. But this is not the end. Our friends from the PyTest team also received the bug report about the vulnerability in PyLib, because it's also a dependency of PyTest. And they did something different. For the next version, PyTest 7, they vendored PyLib, or parts of PyLib. So instead of installing PyLib from PyPI, they took parts of PyLib and put it into PyTest codebase and stripped away the parts they did not need it, and also the vulnerable SVN module. And this worked very well for PyTest. Basically, they rendered PyLib in a very special way. And now the rendered PyLib shadows the installed PyLib from PyPI. So whenever TOX was trying to import from PyLib, it did not see the installed PyLib, but it imported from the rendered PyLib. And that would have been a problem, but they did not render the parts we needed for TOX. So TOX was broken whenever it was installed along PyTest. And you know, this combination of TOX and PyTest is super, super widespread. We were in a serious mess, but we still did not have the capacity to actively work on it. And then something beautiful happened. Soren Spanera, a longtime friend of the TOX project and also a plugin author, announced that he would be able to work a full week on TOX 4. He wanted to help move it over the finish line. At the end, maybe it was not even a full week, but this really gave a new momentum. And also Bernard and I spent as much time possible on TOX. And then, ta-da, only almost after 3 years after the start, TOX 4 was finally released. And you can imagine this was a great relief, both for us, the maintainers, and our users. And can you imagine what happened right after the release? We received tons and tons of bug reports, just like the hour after the release. We received lots of complaints, like, how could you do this? Didn't you test it? And everything. But on the plus side, we also received a lot of contributions after that, like from more than 50 contributors. And even one of them became a part-time TOX maintainer. And why could that happen? We took really great care. We announced the rewrite on all channels many, many times. We tested TOX against hundreds and hundreds of repositories out there. And still, it's all about Harem's law. And it says, with a sufficient number of users of an API, it does not matter what you promise in the contract, all observable behaviors of your system will be depended on by somebody. So we received bug reports for things we didn't even know they are possible with TOX. But now we know. And at that time, I was a little bit frustrated. We put a lot of effort into TOX and people still got angry. Imagine, whenever I contribute to TOX, I take away time from my family and my kids. And yet, people still get angry. At that time, I read that blog post. I'm not your supplier. And this blog post really resonated with me. I certainly do not want to break users. We do not create bugs on purpose. And I do a lot of these things in my spare time. And I don't have a contract with my users. So it's about anybody to use TOX or not. I do not want to bore you with the highlights of the release. You can check out the documentation. But when you have a look at this list, and when you compare it to that what Bernard thought about what we need to do, and what were the issues back then, we pretty much exactly achieved what we wanted. Now we can implement whatever is necessary for the future of TOX. So we are able to more easily maintain TOX and extend it. And how was this possible? We use better abstractions. Before we had 1, 2, 3 huge files with mixed responsibilities, and now we have a config module for the configuration management, an execute module for the command execution. You get the idea. And this design evolved. It was not entirely clear from the beginning. Now it's way easier to contribute to TOX, so maybe it's also something for you. After the release, we sat together and discussed how it went. What did go well? We have a very strong test suite, so it did not uncover all the bugs. We announced the rewrite on all possible channels. We wrote blog posts, we posted on Twitter, on Mastodon, we gave lightning talks, we announced it to the Python forum. But do not think a lot of people test pre-releases. Some do, so thanks for that. We sticked around after release to help the people with the migration and assess possible regressions. And we kept the old documentation, because lots of people stick with older versions. And we kept the TOX3 release branch, and even created another release to ease the migration. Although TOX3 is no longer supported by us. And then we also sat together and thought about what could have we done better. And this sounds odd or even arrogant, right? So let's rephrase it. What could have we done better given the resources? And I think we had very, very little limited time, and it went pretty well. So there are also a couple of lessons learned for rewriting a project with millions and millions of monthly downloads. You really need to have a plan. You need to be ready to re-evaluate everything from the ground up. You need to test a lot. You need to be available post-release, prepare for bug fixes in the coming months after release, and be nice and set boundaries. And cheers to you, Joel. I'm sorry, but no sorry to say that. Legends are not always right. Rewrites can be highly successful. Thank you very much.
We have lots of time for questions.
Okay, so I'll break the ice. You mentioned a project that you use, a tool that you use to work with many repos at the same time, and I missed that, and it was not on the slide.
Yeah, I just mentioned it. It was all repos, all-repos. It was written by Anthony Sotal or by many clones. It's like he created, he's a maintainer of PyTest, he maintainer of Flake 8, of PyUpgrade, and tons of other tools. And he also wrote all repos. And with all repos, you can easily either put in a list of repos or just a GitHub organization, and maybe next cycle I will work on that. We can use it also for Launchpad. And you can clone all repositories. Then you have a couple of commands to grab in those repositories to even replace stuff. And you even can create mass pull requests, which is pretty cool. Like for the SOAP repositories, I cloned them and I increased, testing against a different Python version. Then on one button, and basically created 300 pull requests, which my poor fellow maintainers have to merge then.
Thank you.
Okay. So first of all, great talk. Really like your story there, and kind of the honesty that you had about kind of your process with life happens to everybody. I definitely agree with that. But one thing I kind of wanted to know is what's your motivation for continuing to work on talks? You had kind of mentioned that you don't really get any kind of monetary gain. You're not really paid to continue working on talks. So kind of what's your personal motivation for why you want to continue being an open source maintainer?
Well, I'm an open source enthusiast through and through, and for many years, and I have been using open source for, I don't know, when was SUSE 7.0 released? I think that's when I started to use open source, and it's just a way to give back, and especially working on such an important project like Talks is like a great thing. It's motivation in itself, and it has a lot of impact, maybe not on the world, but on tons and tons of other engineers, and also in the company. It's used across, and this is something I'm really proud of.
2000.
So I have my 23rd anniversary using Linux. I should update my CV. Okay, thank you very much for attending my talk.
Yeah.